Hi everybody, I'm so excited to be able to come and talk about the environment because I've got my data sea legs, so to speak, from being an environmental activist with Friends of the Earth way back in the 80s and with the Japan Tropical Action Forest Network and in the social justice side from the East Timor Alert Network. And what I discovered at that time was that there was very little data as an activist. And so what I decided to do was to go to university and study geomatics. And this is where I really got an understanding of what data are and to start thinking about data in a systems level. And so now I focus my efforts in trying to find ways to make data accessible to the people who need those data. So we've already mentioned that I'm with the European Research Council funded project, the Programmable City Project. It's just a nod to the funders of our research project. Its aim is to continue and build on a body of work by Professor Rob Kitchen from CodeSpace and the Data Revolution. And essentially what I do is I do a qualitative study of quantitative culture, and I do so critically. So it's a very unusual social science kind of project. What I thought was important for us was to look at open data, but also to look at open access to data and to look at some earlier definitions. The 1959 Antarctic Treaty, Agenda 21, Chapter 40, Agenda 21+10, 2002, the Open Knowledge Foundation definition, GEOS data sharing, and the 5-star open data. Why look at those? Well, because they're the precursors of making environmental data accessible. The Antarctic Treaty, for instance, in 1959, essentially said that all scientists, irrespective of their ilk, if they're going to be doing any kind of work in Antarctica, the continent of science, they must share. And they must deposit their data, and they must do so in an interoperable way, and they must collaborate with each other, and they must have their data talk to each other so that they can actually do climate change models and to do this kind of integrated work that we've already heard about. What does it look like today? Well, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research actually manages a very, very sophisticated international portal that, according to many open data enthusiasts, would not be considered an open data portal, even though it's an incredibly sophisticated portal, because of the licensing. They do not allow commercial reuse of their data, and their objectives behind that is to ensure that if any mineral or mine exploration and exploitation is to happen in any of in the Antarctic region, that they're not going to be doing so off the backs of of scientific research that's focused on the preservation of the environment. And also, it's very expensive to actually manage a spatial data infrastructure of this kind of nature. But if we go way back to 1992 in Brazil, we have Agenda 21, Chapter 40, which I think is almost the same as the wonderful report that I read yesterday that you've produced. It has many of the same kinds of recommendations and the early thinking, and I urge any of you, if you haven't read Chapter 40, to go back to this precursor document that really discusses in a very integrated way how to think about making data available, and it deals with interoperability, geospatial, and many, many of the issues that were discussed in the report. In 2002, so Rio +10 in South Africa, we have the Down to Earth report where it did a really in-depth analysis of how can we produce data, collect data, and disseminate and discover data on Africa for sustainable development. Now there's contention about, is sustainable development the way to go, and I think that's a fair contention, but it's well worth going back to these two very early reports that explain and provide really rich context as to how that can be done from a systems infrastructure kind of level. On a different kind of level, a systems of systems level, if you wish, the GEOS, which is essentially the global Earth observation systems of systems. So this is all of the radar systems, all of the satellite systems, GPS systems, location-based systems that are floating around the planet that are continuously monitoring and paying attention to what is going on and producing data, primarily for the private sector, have come up with very robust principles for sharing incredibly expensive data and have come up with an incredibly sophisticated portal by which to do so. Again, for the open data people, because of the non-commercial reuse of their data, they're making it available to researchers and everybody else, but you can't resell these data, but they fulfill everything from the bulk download and so on. It would not be considered an open data type of portal, yet it's one of the world's most sophisticated portals from a systems perspective. So now let's take a look at open data. The two most popular definitions that we defer to today, and they're relatively newcomers on the data space because it's a different community. It's not a scientific community. It's a community of people primarily engaged in e-government and on the civil society side. So it's not always a scientific community that's at the table building these kinds of portals. And I think we can see that by the kinds of definitions. It thinks of the data as an object and not the data as in a cultural practice within a community of practice. And it misses a few things. However, it has created a dialogue for people to come together in other sectors to discuss the kind of socioeconomic data aspects that are also discussed in your report that you think are critically important for the environmental perspective. But it's very much at a technological perspective. What's missing in these is the idea of interoperability. What's missing is georeferencing. What's missing is aggregation, so data protection and so on. Or even for sensitive biodiversity data, you don't put where the very rare animals are as a point on the map because that just invites poachers to come and get them. So we do have to aggregate data. Data quality, not the qualities of the data, but actually data quality is not something that's discussed, or preservation and archiving is not discussed. The systems that I showed you earlier all have those types of discussions that are all built that way. So what open data has done is that it's opened the conversation, which I think is fantastic, but we have a lot of work to do to bring it up to a much higher type of standard. And it's not because it's poor, it's just a different epistemic community that's at the table developing it. If we think of Ireland, and we look at the open data census, which is from the Open Knowledge Foundation, we have Dennis Parvanov here, who's one of the key movers and shakers in that space here in Ireland. If you want to talk with them later, you can. And I just looked at, well, what are the kinds of data sets that are asked for? And really, on the environmental side, there's not much being asked for. It's really pollution emissions is the way that it's evaluated. And how they think about it, generally, when you actually look at this indicator system, is it made available? Can it be reused? Are they online? Can you bulk download them? And are they under an open license? So again, you can see it doesn't look at the quality of the data or the interoperability. It just looks at, is it there? And can I get it in the format that I want? Which again starts the conversation on the administrative side for the data producers, but it hasn't really grown up yet to a kind of mature type of model. Ireland would like to become part of the G8 Open Data Charter. And these are the kinds of data on the left-hand side that are being sought. There is some Earth observation data from the environment side, energy and environment, global development, and social mobility and welfare data. But again, it's some meteorological, it's pollution levels, food security maybe, housing and health. So again, in terms of the substantive side of open data, substantively on the environment is not very robust yet, but for the countries that really haven't considered this at all, it brings them on board. Ireland has become a member of the, the Open Government Partnership, very much so as a result of these gentlemen here at the front. That's in 2013. There is now the Department of Public Expenditure and Revenue has a public bodies working group that's comprised of many people from environment to the OSI to people from heritage, people from transportation and so on, from marine, discussing how to integrate those data sets, how to develop proper metadata standards where they can interoperate a bit more, how to make the data portal a bit more robust, thinking about the geo-enabling of that portal, looking at the licensing issue. So many of the things that you discussed in 2013 in your report are actually coming to fruition. And that's been the benefit of open data, is to stimulate that kind of conversation. The important page for all of us today is to go to the portal, to do a search on environment, to look at the kinds of data sets that are there, but most importantly, suggest what data sets that you want, because the ask in the audit that was in your report was really quite extensive. And so if you want those data, this is the place to go and ask for them, and to suggest that those data sets be made available. But if we look at a more kind of mature model, and this is the Canadian Geospatial Data Infrastructure and the Open Data Model, they have, as part of spatial data infrastructure, open data as a key component of it. And I think there's some thinking going on in Ireland on that front as well, which I think is a very, very welcoming type of discussion. But it means that it's starting to think of open data beyond some of the issues that I mentioned and really trying to integrate and geo-enable a lot of the administrative data. And if we go look, CDGI is the Canadian Geospatial Data Infrastructure Principles. Their principles of openness go much further than what is required in open data. We're talking trusted systems, socio-technological systems, access, managing data closest to the source, interoperability, and so on. And you can get access to all of those reports. They're available online. But they're principles that are very useful to consider when actually thinking of a systematic way and a systemic way of sharing and producing data. So just a couple of examples of data at work that were briefly mentioned in the report, but since the report came out in 2013, many, many things have happened. For instance, open data came to Ireland since that report came out. But the All-Ireland Research Observatory has an awful lot of data and an awful lot of maps. It has multiple services on the environment, multiple data sources, many of which that were discussed, a lot of environmental data in there, commuting data, and so on and so forth. You can also download these data from their portal and access them in multiple formats. So that's a very useful type of resource where people can start using that and right down to the data set. And then, of course, something else that's happened as a result is the Dublin City Dashboard. And the report did mention big data, but I think it was thinking more near real-time data as opposed to big data. And in this case here, there are a number of near real-time data sets that would be of interest that can, to the environmental community that can be visualized through the Dublin Dashboard. So some things to consider. Research data is something very important to consider. If we think of Science Foundation Ireland is funding a tremendous amount of data, where do those research data go? Right now there is no home for those scientific research data that may be related to the environment. So that's one thing. Where are the repositories for the data? Health data, so those were discussed in the report as well. There needs to be a policy on how to share and make those data types accessible, of course taking data protection in mind. And I brought up the International Polar Year because it was one of the first international research projects that mandated researchers that if you wish to do research with us, 10% of the resources that you receive from us in terms of monies must go towards data management and must go to data deposit and must go to data integration and interoperability. And in fact, internationally that has been the case. But we go back to 1959 when the Antarctic Treaty, and that's where this comes from. So if you start following the treaties and you follow them through, we start seeing today some of these very interesting initiatives. In some cases, you're going to have to take government to court. And in this case, the Canadian government was actually taken to court because the Environment Canada, our EPA, so to speak, refused to share pollution data. And this was a 10-year court battle where an environmental organization actually won, and those data did have to be released. I think that's a bit of a long game, and I think it would be worth avoiding this kind of game, but it's to demonstrate that there's a lot of practices around it. I think another thing to consider that government is challenged with is how to, if you're an authoritative institution in the government, how do you bring in crowdsourced data that are produced by the public? Your report discussed citizen science, and it discussed participatory mapping to some extent. These are some excellent resources that were specifically examined in the context of government and how can government bring those in. And these are two other government reports that looked at, well, if government were to consider bringing in crowdsourced data or volunteer geographic information data produced by the public, how could it deal with it and not be considered liable for data that may have some issues in it? And so those are well worth considering. I think one interesting initiative that emerged since your report as well is ISO 37120 indicator standard for sustainable development, primarily focused at smart cities, but could be scaled out. And it's well worth looking at this standard to see how it ties in with your work as well. You probably have examined it, but just in case, there it is, and it's worth looking at. And many of the data issues that you've discussed in your report are put in here as a kind of standard. Final remarks. Data are produced by different data cultures. And I think it's important to think that how environment produces data, biologists produce data, and the OSI produces data, and a researcher produces data is very, very different. On the open data front, we know that, ooh, that was a big fence, that on the open data front, or prior to the open data front, if we think of the access piece that I was discussing, we're talking physical sciences, social sciences, and the geospatial community really shaping that kind of space. After 2005, we start seeing e-government shaping the space, and we start seeing administrative data, and we start seeing public sector kind of ways of thinking. And that's why we have a kind of disconnect between open data to some extent and these other initiatives of more open access to data to some extent. And I think it's important when we look at that we consider those differences and critically reflect on where it is that we want things to go. To conclude, I mean, open data is an opportunity for a very good discussion. It opens the door, it has brought a lot of people to the table, it's creating some infrastructure, it's got international support. But if we stick strictly to an openness ideology, we actually may censor out some data from portals because they don't have a particular license. And so, in fact, that is what is ongoing. Many governments have decided, well, I'm not going to put, some of the sophisticated data sets that I mentioned earlier into the portal because they're not in an open format or they don't follow a particular license. The PSI reuse license, for instance, would not be considered an open data license. So this is something that needs to be considered. Geomatics and science open access is a much more mature type of, if I may use the term erroneously, ecosystem in the socio-technical sense of the term ecosystem. And I think the open data communities can learn from these, and I think it's very interesting to see in Ireland that is in fact how the open data community is shaping up and how the public bodies working group is shaping up. And those working on the environment really should leverage both opportunities and find the best way of making your concerns heard and putting in the ask for the data that you're looking for. Thank you.